You think you know the shape of your own family history, the crisp, clean lines of marriage, separation, and finality. But when my daughter laid out the wedding quilt, sewn from scraps of our lives, the center square held a secret note, folded small and brittle, which unraveled 40 years of assumed truth and cold, quiet peace. Our narrator, Veronica, 60s, is a successful independent woman who has lived contentedly as a divorcee for 4 decades, believing her marriage to Jonathan ended definitively when he left town abruptly in 1985. The setting is the present day, during her daughter Chloe's wedding rehearsal in their small, picturesque college town. The emotional tone is one of sudden, destabilizing shock. The comforting symbol of family unity, the quilt, has become a vessel for profound, hidden doubt about her past and her legal status. The morning light in the conservatory was soft, filtered through the high, arched glass and catching the faint dust motes in the air. The room was prepared for joy. Linen-draped tables, quiet arrangements of white roses, the low, steady murmur of final preparations. But my own world had just tilted on its axis, silently, violently, while holding a quilt. My daughter, Chloe, stood before me, her face alight with the serene, hopeful glow of a woman on her wedding day. She held out the quilt, her gift to me, just before the chaos of the ceremony began. It was a beautiful thing. A heavy, intricate patchwork quilt crafted entirely from family memory. Patches of my mother's favorite silk shawl, swatches of baby blankets, squares cut from old graduation robes. It was a tangible map of our history, stitched together with care and intention. Chloe had called it the family chronicle. I ran my hands over the various textures, the cool linen, the familiar roughness of a worn denim patch. Each square held a whisper of a shared past. The warmth of the quilt was immediate, comforting, but my hands were cold, sensing the impending disruption. My eyes settled on one square in particular. A deep, rich velvet, embroidered with my own initial, a sweeping stylized V. It was cut from the dress I wore at my own wedding reception, nearly 30 years ago. It represented the genesis of this family, the beginning of the story that culminated in Chloe's day. I ran my finger along the tightly stitched seam that secured the embroidered V to the surrounding silk. I felt a slight stiffness beneath the velvet, a resistance that shouldn't have been there. It felt like something small, something folded, tucked deep inside the heavy batting. My heart gave a faint, quick thump, but I masked the reaction instantly, tucking the quilt over my arm, moving toward the quiet corner near the tall potted ferns. I excused myself, needing a moment of solitude before the guests arrived. In the brief, private silence of the corner, shielded by the large, dark green leaves, I found a pair of small, sharp sewing scissors tucked into a pocket of my gown. With slow, controlled movements, I carefully snipped the threads of the seam surrounding the velvet V. The sound was almost imperceptible, a tiny, soft snip of thread parting from fabric. The batting was thick. I reached deep into the cavity and pulled out a small folded piece of heavy cream-colored paper. It was folded so tightly, it had become stiff with memory. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The scent of old paper and cedar, the scent of my ex-husband's study, rose to meet me. My eyes fixed on the handwriting. It was unmistakable. Jonathan's. Precise, sharp, the letters perfectly formed, the elegant, decisive script of a man who dealt in certainties. The note was short, its message a single devastating sentence. I read the words once, then twice, the certainty of the script anchoring the impossible lie of the statement. I never signed the divorce papers. We are still bound. A dizzying wave of panic rose up, threatening to dissolve the carefully constructed order of the room, of the day, of my last 10 years. My lungs seemed to seize, the breath trapped painfully in my chest. The world outside the fern leaves, the busy waiters, the faint sound of music from the hall, felt distant, unreal. The divorce, finalized a decade ago, had been my carefully orchestrated freedom. The final decree, signed and sealed, had been the document that allowed me to rebuild, to breathe, to be Veronica, unbound. I had moved forward, secured my estate, and redefined my entire identity around that single official truth. If this was true, if Jonathan, a meticulous, legally savvy man who had the power to stop the process, had deliberately sabotaged the final signing, what did it mean? The questions hammered at the shield of my denial. What was my status? Was the new will I drafted invalid? Was my entire estate, the security I had worked so fiercely to build for Chloe, still legally shared property? Was the entire foundation of my independence built on a lie held hostage by the precise script of a vengeful man? I looked from the note to the ballroom entrance, where Chloe's laughter just sounded bright and clear. The contrast was a sudden sharp pain. I didn't let the panic take hold. My immediate, primal instinct was to shield my daughter. Her day, her pure, unblemished joy, could not be tainted by the bitter residue of her parents' failed history. With a cold, surgical calmness, I folded the note again, pushing it deep into the palm of my hand. I retrieved the small scissors, quickly and neatly stitching the small cut in the quilt seam with a thread I pulled from a loose fringe, a temporary, invisible repair. The family chronicle was sealed again, the terrible secret tucked deep into the heart of my own wedding memory. I smoothed the velvet patch. The heirloom was safe. Chloe's day was safe. But I, Veronica, stood in the quiet corner, holding a piece of paper that had just invalidated my last 10 years and placed a massive question mark over my entire estate. My identity, my future, my financial security. All were suspended in a horrifying legal limbo. The music swelled, signaling the start of the processional. I took a deep, controlled breath. The crisis had begun, and no one, especially not Chloe, could ever know. Here is the script for Chapter 2, The Missing Record, crafted to build tension and reveal the bureaucratic nightmare that confirms the crisis, while capturing Veronica's mixed emotions in the required style. The morning after Chloe's wedding was quiet, the silence of the house thick with the memory of celebration and the cold, unyielding weight of the note tucked into my gown pocket. I felt a nervous energy, sharp and relentless, propelling me out of the stillness. I couldn't trust the note alone. I needed the administrative reality, the cold, hard proof that stood outside of Jonathan's precise, vengeful script. I dressed in clothes that felt deliberately mundane, blending into the everyday rush of the town. My destination, the county clerk's office. A place of dull varnish, fluorescent hum, and the final, unquestionable word of the state. The clerk's office was busy, smelling of old paper and lukewarm coffee. It was a place where life's major dramas, birth, death, property, dissolution, were reduced to rows of neat files and bureaucratic procedure. I took a number, waiting patiently amidst people applying for marriage licenses and settling traffic tickets. The irony was a bitter, internal ache. When my number was called, I approached the counter managing a calm, practiced smile. My pretense was simple. I was retrieving old property deeds related to a forgotten rental property, a necessary update for my current estate planning. It was a cover story that utilized my true, existing need for legal clarity, masking the immense foundational crisis I was actually facing. I guided the conversation subtly toward the archives, the place where the deep history was stored. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, was efficient, retrieving the heavy bound logbooks that predated the digital system. I requested the records for the year of my supposed divorce, 1985. I watched, my chest tight, as the clerk's finger tracked across the faded, typewritten ledger entries. She found the name: Thomas, Jonathan, and Veronica. The docket number. The date of initial filing. She left the counter and returned moments later with a heavy, brown folder tied with a thin, brittle string. The folder felt like a solid block of sealed time. I leaned over the counter, pretending to review the property filings, while my eyes fixed on the manila folder. She opened the file, shuffling through the stiff, yellowed pages. She found the initial petition, the summons, and the records of the mandatory court dates I had faithfully attended. All the evidence of my decision, my effort, my intention to leave Jonathan. Then she paused. Her finger stopped at the final section of the file, the space where the decree of dissolution should have resided. The document was there, but its status was chilling. The final decree was present, drafted and ready for signatures. But stamped clearly across the page, in bold, stark red ink, were the administrative notations that confirmed the nightmare of Jonathan's note. Filed but unsigned by respondent. And beneath it, the procedural designation that sealed my fate. Case status: pending/stalled. The administrative reality was a cold, quiet blow. The court hadn't dismissed the case. They had simply allowed it to stall indefinitely due to a lack of completion from the respondent, Jonathan. In the eyes of the law, the divorce was never finalized. We were legally still married. I felt a dizzying wave of disorientation, a sense of having lived a decade of my life on borrowed time. built on a legal fiction. My mind raced. Why did the court allow the case to stall indefinitely without resolution? In that era, lacking a plaintiff's follow-up due to a respondent's purposeful inaction, the court would often simply remove the case from the active docket and leave the status unresolved. The responsibility to push the final paperwork rested with the petitioner, me. And why didn't I receive any follow-up notification? I remembered the chaos of the move, the change of address, the simple fatal assumption that my lawyer had completed the final bureaucratic cleanup. I had trusted the process, assuming that in the absence of contact, the dissolution had simply taken effect. The chilling administrative truth confirmed Jonathan's note, but it also unearthed something long buried within me. It wasn't just panic I felt. It was a strange, unsettling mix of betrayal and a resurfacing of long-buried feelings. Betrayal, yes, the precise, surgical nature of Jonathan's sabotage. He had engineered this legal limbo deliberately, keeping me bound by an invisible thread. But the resurfacing feelings were deeper, more confusing. A flicker of recognition of the deep, complicated bond we once shared. A man who would go to such lengths to keep a tie, even a painful one, was a man whose complexity I had never truly escaped. He hadn't just not signed. He had preserved the right to the connection. I quickly regained my composure, covering the betrayal and the resurfaced memory with a mask of efficient concern. Ah, the old case, I murmured to the clerk, pointing to the pending status. Messy legalities. So this means it needs reopening, I assume? For the property transfer. The clerk, thankfully, was focused on procedure, not my internal crisis. Yes, ma'am. You'd need a new attorney to refile or motion for dismissal based on abandonment. But yes, it's technically still open. Pending/stalled. The words echoed in my mind as I thanked the clerk, carefully gathering my false property deeds, leaving the heavy, damning file resting on the municipal shelf. I left the clerk's office, walking out into the bright, indifferent sunshine. The world felt unnaturally sharp now, exposed. I was not the independent woman of my own making. I was still the wife of Jonathan Thomas. The estate I had built, the future I planned for Chloe, the legal foundation of my entire identity, all were held captive by the simple, cold fact of a missing signature. The urgent question was no longer if Jonathan was lying, but why he had chosen to reveal this devastating truth now, 7 years after our last contact, by stitching it into my daughter's wedding quilt. The revelation was not passive. It was an active step toward confrontation. I had to assume that the preservation of the legal bond meant Jonathan was planning to use it. This chapter is crucial for confirming the deliberate nature of Jonathan's actions and introducing the element of financial coercion. I will focus on the frailty of the retired attorney, the specific detail of the cashier's check, and the chilling realization of Jonathan's long-term planning, all while maintaining the required cinematic and reflective tone. The law office was quiet, smelling of dust and dried leather. It was a space belonging entirely to the past, much like the man I had come to see. I had spent the morning tracking down the retired junior attorney, who had handled the initial filing of my divorce 10 years ago. Mr. Harrison. He was frail now, his memory fragmented, held together by the thin threads of routine and habit. I found him in a small rented office suite, surrounded by boxes of old files and the quiet hum of an outdated air conditioning unit. He greeted me with a polite, vacant look, his eyes struggling to place my face in the crowded library of his memories. My pretense was that of a concerned former client, hoping to retrieve a specific, archived property document. I spoke slowly, gently, guiding him through the labyrinth of our shared legal history. I laid the ground carefully, introducing the names: Jonathan, Veronica, the 1985 dissolution. He settled back in his worn chair, tapping a long bony finger on a leather blotter. He spoke in slow, hesitant fragments, piecing the distant case together like shards of fragile glass. "Ah, yes," he murmured, his eyes unfocused. "The Thomas matter. Civil, not contentious. Mostly." He vaguely remembered the details, the quick, mutual agreement to separate, the clarity of my intention. He recalled that Jonathan was supposed to sign the final papers and return them from out west, a vague, shifting location that served as Jonathan's initial vanishing point after we separated. He was moving on, Mr. Harrison recalled, shaking his head slightly. Moving away. We just needed his final mark on the document. Simple procedure. The attorney's memory held fast to one specific, perplexing detail that contradicted the case's supposed simplicity. But the papers never came back, he stated, his voice gaining a brief moment of clarity. I kept the file open, expecting a courier, a fax. Nothing. No signature. The case stalled. We had to notify the court. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a profound professional secret. But then a few weeks later, something peculiar happened. A cashier's check arrived. He described the check in detail. It was for a hefty sum, easily covering the maximum billable hours for the entire case and then some. Crucially, it was a cashier's check, drawn on an obscure bank in a distant state, untraceable back to Jonathan, or to any account I would have known. It was delivered via registered mail. A sterile final financial transaction. Mr. Harrison shrugged, a tired gesture of professional relief. I assumed, he said, tapping the blotter again, that Mr. Thomas, realizing the process was stalled, simply sent payment to close the file. To cover all my potential further work and, well, by my inaction, we had been paid in full, with a handsome retainer. No ethical reason to pursue a non-responsive client further, especially with the filing technically complete. He had simply closed the firm's books on the file, assuming the court would eventually dismiss the case based on abandonment. He never questioned the source of the funds or the abrupt finality of the untraceable payment. He accepted the check as a green light to buy his silence and inaction. The truth slammed into me with the force of a cold wind. Jonathan's departure had not been spontaneous. It had been planned, down to the final calculated step of the legal proceedings. The check was not a settlement, it was a bribe. A deliberate financial maneuver to ensure the divorce remained in that chilling pending/stalled limbo without any further inconvenient follow-up from my representative. He had neutralized my lawyer, bought the silence of the court record, and preserved his legal bond to me, all while maintaining the absolute physical distance of his supposed running away. A chill ran through me, far colder than the air conditioning. This wasn't simple procrastination. It was malice with an agenda. Jonathan had spent years meticulously building a legal tether to me. But why? Was Jonathan waiting for something specific before completing the process? Was he holding the legal bond as leverage against a future event? Or did he deliberately leave their legal status in limbo simply to ensure that my assets, my estate, and my hard-won independence were permanently, irrevocably complicated? The chilling conclusion was that he hadn't just left me. He had ensnared me. The untraceable check was the final, expensive proof of his 7-year plan. I thanked Mr. Harrison, my voice sounding strained and hollow in the dusty office. I left him to his quiet solitude, a man paid handsomely to forget the last piece of the puzzle. I walked out onto the bustling street, the sunlight blinding after the gloom of the archive office. I now understood the structure of the crisis. Jonathan had created a legal time bomb, and the note in the quilt was the first terrifying tick. The question of why he waited so long to reveal his position was now more urgent than ever. He had left our legal status in limbo, and that limbo, I realized, was the perfect weapon. He was waiting for the right moment to claim the asset of being my legal husband. The moment, I feared, had arrived with Chloe's wedding. I couldn't live with the question mark stitched into the velvet. After the lawyer's evasion, the need for certainty was acute, a surgeon's demand for a clean incision. I took the wedding quilt, the family chronicle, my daughter's perfect gift, and laid it out on the spare room's large polished table. It felt sacrilegious, this act of necessary dissection. My focus was entirely on the velvet patch with the embroidered V, the site of my own wedding memory, and the hiding place of Jonathan's devastating note. I carefully snipped the threads of my hasty, temporary repair, and then, slowly, meticulously, began to unpick the final stitches that secured the velvet square to the surrounding silk. This was not a quick cut. This was an undoing, an unraveling of the fabric of our life together. As I worked, the room was silent save for the soft, repetitive snip of the small scissors. The velvet was thick and heavy, a deep bruised purple that symbolized the complicated weight of the marriage it represented. I peeled the velvet back, exposing the clean white batting beneath, the small void where the note had rested. But the batting wasn't uniform. Near the center, pressed flat against the cotton fibers of the backing, was an unexpected stiffness. I inserted the tip of the scissors and gently lifted the batting away from the thick quilt lining. Sewn flat against the hidden lining, secured by fine, almost invisible white thread, was a small faded photograph. It was an intimate, deliberate placement, a second deeper secret hidden beneath the first. I carefully clipped the securing threads and lifted the photograph free. It was slightly warped with age, its edges softened by time and friction. The image was distinct, though a portrait, not a candid snapshot. The subject was Jonathan. The sight of him was an immediate shock. This was not the sharp, youthful, dark-haired man who had walked out of my life in 1985. This Jonathan was older, his hair silvered at the temples, his face lined and tired, marked by the 7 years of life he had lived in the interim. But the sharp, precise set of his jaw, the intellectual intensity in his eyes, it was unmistakably him. He was standing in the foreground, wearing a heavy wool sweater, his arms crossed. The background was the real revelation. A rustic, isolated log cabin set deep in a thicket of pine trees. The architecture was specific. A heavy stone chimney, a deep shaded porch. My mind, forced into this painful excavation of memory, instantly recognized the scene. It wasn't random. It was the private, remote nature preserve cabin we had visited only once, during a secretive winter honeymoon years before our divorce, a hidden place known only to a few wealthy friends. We had sworn to keep its location absolute secret. The photograph provided a brutal, undeniable truth. Jonathan wasn't merely missing. He had been intentionally hiding in a known, pre-selected location. A secure, private vault of memory that only I would recognize. His vanishing act was a deliberate choice of exile, not a flight of panic. He had retreated to a place of shared, deep intimacy, preserving his connection to me even in his physical absence. But the most critical question now centered on agency. The photograph was taken years after the divorce filing, likely close to the time of his death. The note was hidden in the V-patch, referencing our marriage. Did Jonathan put the note and the photograph in the quilt? If he did, he would have had to travel from that remote cabin, access my house or a storage unit, retrieve the quilt, perform the surgical stitching, and then return the quilt to Chloe's possession. A scenario that seemed nearly impossible for a man intent on absolute secrecy, especially as the quilt was a gift for Chloe's wedding. The far more terrifying possibility was that someone else delivered this message. A third party, an accomplice, an executor, a messenger, who was tasked with completing Jonathan's final act of control. This person had to know the contents of the sealed divorce file, the location of Jonathan's secret hiding spot, the cabin, the significance of the V-patch on Chloe's wedding quilt, the precise timing of Chloe's wedding day. I carefully smoothed the faded photograph, resting it on the polished table beside the quilt. The realization was chilling. My crisis had moved beyond a legal challenge over an estate and into a zone of immediate, personal danger. Someone was watching me, monitoring my life, and holding the final intimate details of my secret history as a weapon. The messenger, the person who had sewn the photograph into the heirloom, was the true present threat. They were the one who broke the seal on Jonathan's self-imposed exile, and their arrival in my life was timed perfectly to coincide with the greatest public celebration of my independence. I looked at the quilt, now slightly damaged, a map of my family history corrupted by a hidden act of sabotage. I had to find the source of that message, the hand that stitched the final terrible truth into my daughter's happiness. The next step had to be to identify that cabin and confirm Jonathan's final location. This chapter relies on internal tension and the ambiguity of perception, using the contrast between the scene's public joy and Veronica's private dread. I will focus on the sensory details of the ceremony, the chilling ambiguity of the shadowy figure, and the crushing realization that Jonathan's presence, real or imagined, dominates the moment, all within the required reflective cinematic style. The moment was perfect. The air was warm and smelled of white roses and freshly cut grass. Chloe stood beneath an archway draped with linen and flowers, her voice clear and resonant as she spoke her vows. The sight of her, radiant and deeply happy, should have been all-consuming. But my vision was fractured, the joy of the present moment constantly undermined by the dark seed of the past. The image of Jonathan's tired face from the hidden photograph, standing before that remote cabin, was burned into my mind. I knew he was hiding. I knew he was capable of malice. And I knew someone had sent a precise, devastating message to me on this day. My attention during the ceremony was only partially on the words spoken. I was locked in a painful private contradiction. I was the proud mother, yet I was also the nervous investigator. My eyes darted across the assembled guests. A sparse, intimate group of family and close friends. I knew every face, every history, but I was looking for the unknown. I was searching for the messenger who had stitched the photograph into the quilt, the person who had orchestrated the timing of this crisis. And terrifyingly, I was searching for Jonathan himself. The setting was idyllic. A sweeping green lawn that stretched down to a perimeter defined by a stand of ancient oak trees. These trees were massive, gnarled, and deep with shadow even in the midday sun. They formed a natural curtain between the light of the ceremony and the wilder, hidden edges of the property. It was during the quietest part of the vows, a moment of profound, shared silence that focused all attention on Chloe and her future, that I let my gaze drift deliberately, dangerously, toward the stand of ancient oaks. I was looking for the messenger. Instead, I saw a shape that froze the breath in my lungs. Across the field, tucked deep into the darkest shadow cast by the heaviest oak, was a shadowy figure. They were motionless, framed by the rough, dark bark and the low-hanging branches. They were too far away for any detail, their features dissolved by the distance and the deep shade. But the general build, the height, the slight slump of the shoulders, the way the figure stood with a particular still intensity, matched the older, more tired Jonathan from the photograph. It was impossible. A hallucination born of stress and terror. Yet I couldn't look away. The figure was standing perfectly still, absolutely silent, their focus directed entirely toward the bright, joyous centerpiece of the ceremony. The feeling that engulfed me was a chilling, absolute certainty. He was here. Not the messenger, not a surrogate. The man who refused to formally sever the ties, the man who had deliberately remained my legal husband, was present to witness the wedding of the daughter he was legally bound to. The figure remained visible for a long, silent minute. A minute that felt stretched thin, outside of time, existing only for my private dread. They were not smiling, not participating, simply observing. A detached, silent presence at the culmination of the life he chose to leave. Then, just as the ceremony reached its peak, the exchange of rings, the moment of physical and legal union, the shadowy figure retreated. They didn't walk quickly, didn't run. They simply dissolved into the deeper woods behind the oak stand, stepping backward, melting into the undergrowth until the shape was gone entirely. The movement was practiced, quiet and final, suggesting someone who knew how to remain unseen. No one else saw it. The guests were lost in the moment, caught up in the beautiful, singular focus of the vows. I was the only witness to the man who watched from the shadows. Was this a fleeting hallucination? A trick of light and fear? The mind's cruel invention to match the photograph? Perhaps. The distance and the shadow made absolute confirmation impossible. But the emotional reality was undeniable. Jonathan was near. He was orbiting the life he had refused to formally sever himself from. His presence, whether real or imagined, was a final crushing act of control. He hadn't just stalled the divorce to seize property. He had stalled it to preserve his right to observe, to remain the silent, permanent husband, entitled to the full scope of my life, even its moments of greatest joy. The realization consumed me. The legal tether he maintained was not just financial, it was existential. The officiant pronounced the couple married. The applause was loud, a sudden joyous wave of sound that broke the painful silence of my fear. Chloe turned, beaming, her joy radiating out into the world. I managed to smile, to applaud, to embrace my daughter with the appropriate warmth. I masked the cold tremor that ran through me, the knowledge that my triumph, my daughter's happiness, my supposed freedom, was shadowed by a man who had intentionally preserved his right to judge it from the darkness. I did not move toward the oak trees. The time for running was over. The time for denial was over. The crisis was no longer about a technicality. It was about the immediate threat of Jonathan's presence, confirmed by the hidden photo and the shadow in the crowd. I had to assume he was near. I had to assume he was still watching. And I had to assume his next step would be not just to claim the estate, but to reveal his presence and assert the legal bond he had so meticulously preserved. My focus shifted from the archives to the mountain cabin. I had to find out what he was hiding there. The shadows of the oak trees still felt heavy on my memory, the ghostly image of Jonathan a persistent, chilling accusation. I spent the day after the wedding locked in my study, the adrenaline of the morning replaced by a cold, surgical focus. The photograph was the only solid lead, a single undeniable truth amidst the legal and emotional chaos. The quiet, desperate work of triangulation began. I spread out the faded, hidden photo next to an aging nature preserve map. A map I had kept from our single, secret winter trip years ago. The map, yellowed and creased, felt like a relic from a life I barely remembered. The cabin was nestled deep within the preserve, a private, non-public section known for its extreme isolation. The features in the photograph, the distinctive heavy stone chimney, the unique cluster of 3 towering silver fir pines near the porch, the exact angle of the steep, rocky slope behind the structure, were the keys. I used a magnifying glass and a ruler, meticulously cross-referencing the architectural and geological features of the photo, with the contour lines and hand-drawn landmarks on the map. It was a precise, exacting task, a job that suited my analytical mind, pulling me away from the emotional terror and grounding me in physical fact. After hours of quiet, focus work, I managed to pinpoint the exact location of the isolated cabin. The coordinates were remote, situated at the terminus of a disused logging road, miles from the nearest paved track. It was the perfect place for a man to disappear and conduct a 7-year vigil over his former life. The decision to go was immediate and absolute. I needed to see the place, to touch the walls he had sheltered behind, to find the source of the photograph and the note. The journey began the next morning. I drove a reliable, anonymous vehicle packing only essentials: food, maps, a small legal pad, and the silver flask Jonathan had always favored. The journey was long, a slow, methodical retreat from the order and familiarity of my normal life. I watched the suburban sprawl give way to rolling hills, then to the dense, unforgiving rise of the mountain range. Each mile driven was a conscious severance from the woman I had become. The calls from well-meaning friends about Chloe's perfect wedding went unanswered. The emails about the foundation's next board meeting remained unread. I was pulling myself out of my carefully constructed present and plunging back into the unresolved past. The final hour of the drive was on the disused logging road, a rough, deeply rutted track that demanded all my focus. The trees pressed in close, the sunlight fractured and weak. The road seemed to swallow the sound of the engine, leaving the pervasive quiet of the deep woods. The isolation was profound, the air cold and sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth. As the miles accumulated, the initial fear solidified into a single, gnawing, inescapable question that cycled relentlessly in my mind. Why the unsigned papers? The legal motive was clear: to preserve his claim to the estate and his assets. But the personal motive was a shifting shadow, elusive and terrifying. Lingering attachment? Was the refusal to sign a desperate, complicated gesture of love, a way for an emotionally stunted man to say, "I can't let you go entirely"? Did he hide himself away, preserving the legal bond as a bittersweet comfort? Complicated legal motive? Was it leverage? Was he waiting for a specific event, my remarriage perhaps, or a specific financial windfall to spring the trap? Was the legal limbo a calculated move to gain a financial advantage that transcended the simple division of assets? Deliberate, cruel act of control? Or was it the simplest, darkest answer? A final, malicious act of control? A refusal to grant me the self-determination and legal clarity I had worked so hard to earn. Did he leave the papers and sign simply to ensure that, even in his absence, I would never truly be free? The image of the shadowy figure watching Chloe's wedding from the oaks argued for the cruelest motive: the need for absolute, silent control over my happiness. I finally reached the end of the logging road. The car stopped in a small, overgrown clearing. Ahead, framed by the dense pine forest, stood the cabin. It was exactly as depicted in the photograph. Rustic, isolated, dominated by the heavy stone chimney. It looked silent, empty, and deeply settled into its exile. I cut the engine. The resulting silence was immense, unbroken save for the distant sound of wind sighing through the pines. The air felt colder now. I sat for a long moment, the quiet weight of the mountains pressing down. I had the coordinates. I had the location. Now I had to find out if this remote cabin held the key to Jonathan's legal malice or his complicated grief. I took the first step out of the car, onto the cold, damp earth. The search for the missing signature had finally brought me to the place where he had spent his silent final years. This chapter provides the physical access point to the final secret, and introduces the critical witness who holds the key to Jonathan's timeline and motivation. I will focus on the atmosphere of the isolated cabin, the eccentric charm of the caretaker, and the chilling significance of the rusted key and the phrase "it was time," maintaining the required reflective cinematic style. The air in the clearing was cold, the silence immense. I stood before the cabin, the physical realization of Jonathan's 7-year exile. It was exactly as the photograph depicted. Rustic, isolated, its wood weathered silver gray, deep in the shadow of the pines. The windows were dark, the stone chimney cold. It felt empty, utterly settled into its own stillness. I walked up the few steps to the porch. The front door was heavy, solid wood, and as expected, locked. I pressed my hand against the rough wood, feeling the cold certainty of the barrier. The man who refused to leave my life had, nonetheless, locked himself away from it entirely. The moment I stepped off the porch, a movement caught my eye. Tucked behind the cabin, in a small patch of unexpected sunlight, was a chaotic but thriving vegetable garden. And tending it, humming softly to herself, was an elderly woman. She was small, eccentric, and dressed in mismatched, brightly colored layers that clashed joyfully with the muted tones of the forest. This was Martha, the preserve's caretaker, the only person besides the navigator who had seen Jonathan in his exile. She looked up at me, her face a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes bright and shrewd. She seemed neither surprised nor alarmed by my sudden appearance. "You look lost, dear," she said, her voice warm but tinged with the slight, dry roughness of a life spent outdoors. "Unless you're looking for the man who lives in the quiet house." I walked toward the garden, the smell of rich, damp soil replacing the sharp scent of pine. "I'm looking for Jonathan Thomas," I confirmed, keeping my voice calm, professional. "I'm his ex-wife." Martha smiled, a wide, genuine expression that softened the sternness of her eyes. "Ex-wife," she repeated, turning back to pull a stubborn weed. "That was his word for you two. Though, he spoke of you like you were still the center of his orbit." She confirmed that Jonathan lived in the cabin until very recently. She described him as a quiet, solitary man, keeping entirely to himself. He received no visitors, no mail, and left the preserve only once a month for supplies. He lived a life of deliberate, absolute simplicity. Martha then spoke the words that pierced the armor of my denial. "He was a strange one. Always quiet, but he'd occasionally ask after you. Not directly. He'd ask about the town, the seasons, the new people moving in. And he'd always ask about the young woman with the good laugh. His daughter. Said she deserved all the happiness the world could offer." The thought of Jonathan, the elusive watcher, receiving vague reports of Chloe's life, of her growing up and marrying, while sitting in this quiet exile, was devastating. The complicated control was rooted in a genuine, deeply flawed attachment. Martha finally stood up, wiping her hands on her faded gardening apron. She reached into the deep pocket of her overalls and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a small rusted key. It was tarnished and pitted by time and moisture, clearly very old. "He told me to give this to you," she said, holding it out to me. "If you ever came looking. He gave it to me about 2 months ago. Paid me a handsome sum to hold on to it." I took the key. It was cold, surprisingly heavy, and its teeth were simple, robust. It was a key designed for an old solid lock. "What did he say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Martha looked out past the pines, toward the distant, hazy line of the horizon. "He looked tired that day. Worn down. He said very simply, 'Tell Veronica it was time.' And then he packed his remaining things and drove away. He didn't say where he was going. Just time." The single phrase, "it was time," resonated with chilling finality. It wasn't a spontaneous act. It was the execution of a pre-planned phase. The timetable was his and his alone. It was time for what? Time to leave the exile? Time to trigger the legal crisis? Time to release the final hidden truth? The timing was undeniable. He left the cabin right around the time the note and photograph were stitched into the quilt and delivered to me for Chloe's wedding. This confirmed the elaborate orchestration. Jonathan had left the cabin and initiated the final, explosive confrontation. And now the rusted key was the final instruction, the literal means of access to his hidden life. What did he intend for me to find inside the cabin? Not a body. Martha confirmed he drove away. It had to be the proof of his actions, the motive for his sabotage, or the final piece of the legal puzzle, the signed papers perhaps kept as the ultimate piece of leverage. I thanked Martha, the words feeling inadequate for the weight of the trust she had held. She merely smiled, turning back to her thriving garden, content in her role as the quiet keeper of the preserved secrets. I returned to the front door of the cabin, the small rusted key cold and solid in my hand. It was the key to my past, my legal nightmare, and the motive of the man who refused to grant me freedom. I inserted the key into the heavy, antique lock. It turned easily, smoothly, with a definite metallic clunk that felt loud in the wilderness silence. The lock was simple, designed to keep out nature, not malice. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the cold brass knob. Beyond the door lay the final physical evidence of Jonathan's life since 1985. The entire 7-year silence and the reason for the legal limbo was waiting for me inside. I pushed the door open, stepping across the threshold into the deep wood-scented shadow of the cabin, ready to face the truth he left behind. This is the climactic chapter where the legal mystery is solved, but the emotional one deepens. I will focus on the Spartan reality of the cabin, the sensory detail of the signed documents, and the profound emotional relief contrasted with the new question of timing and motive, all delivered in the required reflective cinematic style. The door swung inward with a slow, heavy creak that sounded final. I stepped across the threshold, leaving the clean, sharp air of the mountain forest for the dense, contained atmosphere of the cabin. The light inside was muted, dusty, filtering through the single-pane windows. The cabin was Spartan. A single room dominated by a wood-burning stove, a narrow cot, and a single sturdy wooden desk. It smelled strongly of cedar and old paper, a quiet, clean scent of solitary existence. This was the space where Jonathan had chosen to spend the final years of his life, observing the world from a distance. The physical reality of his self-imposed exile was almost a comfort, a proof of his sacrifice, but the motive remained elusive. My eyes went immediately to the desk. It was the only truly busy surface in the room, the place where his long vigil had been formalized. The wood was clean but scarred with the marks of hard use. And there, placed neatly in the center of the desk, were the documents. They were stacked with Jonathan's characteristic, unsettling precision, weighted down by a smooth, heavy river stone. This was not a forgotten mess. This was a deliberate presentation. I walked toward the desk, my footsteps muffled by the thick, dust-covered rug. My hands, which had been cold and shaking since I found the note, were now strangely steady. I reached out and removed the stone weight. The documents were official. Legal paper, heavy stock. I didn't need to read the content immediately. The title at the top, bold and stark, was enough. Decree of Dissolution of Marriage. The document was fully prepared. A carbon copy of the one I had left and signed in the clerk's office 10 years ago. But this one was complete. I scanned the final page, finding the space for the respondent's signature. There it was. Jonathan Thomas. Signed in his distinctive, precise script. A deliberate final mark. The date stamp beside the signature was what stopped my breath. 3 days before Chloe's wedding. The physical presence of the signed papers was an overwhelming relief. A sudden immense wave of gravity lifting from my chest. 10 years of legal limbo. 10 years of a life built on a terrifying technicality, dissolved in the face of this single clean signature. I was free. Legally unbound. The silence of the house, the shame of the pending case, the fear of the estate being compromised. It was all suddenly over. I sank onto the wooden stool beside the desk, letting the clean paper rest in my lap, feeling the profound, dizzying weight of my newfound legal clarity. The crisis had passed its legal peak. But the relief was short-lived, quickly replaced by the chill of a new central mystery. Why now? Why did he sign them now, after 40 years of quiet, deliberate refusal? Why maintain the silence, preserve the legal bond, force the confrontation, and then at the very moment of his public appearance, the shadow at Chloe's wedding, choose to legally release me? The motive could not be simple inertia. It had to be a calculated release. Beside the stack of signed papers was a single heavier sheet of paper. A handwritten, reflective letter addressed simply to Veronica. The paper was rough, the ink flowing, the script looser than the official signature, revealing the man beneath the professional mask. I picked up the letter. It felt warm from the sun that had filtered through the window all day. I read the first lines, my eyes moving quickly across his familiar, elegant script. My dearest V, I know the burden I placed upon you. I never intended for this to be about property. It was always about time. About waiting for the right moment to ensure the inheritance was whole. The revelation was profound. He hadn't withheld the signature out of malice, but out of a complicated, perverse sense of protection. He had waited for a specific, unseen timeline to conclude before he felt safe releasing me and the estate. The signing, dated 3 days before Chloe's wedding, confirmed that his departure from the cabin, his final decisive act, was time to end his legal control just as my daughter began her married life. The letter was a confession of a long, terrible secret he had guarded with his own exile and his silent legal tether. He had stayed bound to me to protect something until the moment Chloe was safe, financially or otherwise. The estate was a shield and he was the reluctant guard. But what event, what timeline, had he been waiting for that concluded exactly 3 days before the wedding? What required his physical exile and legal binding for the full 7 years, only to be released now? The cabin, the signed papers, and the letter all pointed to a final shared history. A secret that demanded his 7-year sacrifice and his precise, final gesture of letting go. I stood in the silent cabin, holding the signed papers and the open letter. The sense of freedom was immense, but it was purchased at the price of understanding an immense 7-year lie. The divorce was settled. The legal fight was over before it began. The crisis now was purely emotional and investigative. What was the inheritance he protected? What was the event that defined the right moment? Jonathan hadn't left a mystery of law. He had left a mystery of love and sacrifice, bound by the rigid constraints of a schedule only he understood. I folded the letter, securing it with the final signed decree. The Spartan cabin now felt like a confessional, a silent witness to a man's deeply flawed, agonizing attempt to protect the people he loved by pushing them away. I had to find the source of his timeline. The light in the cabin was failing, but the words on the page were starkly clear. I held the handwritten letter, the texture of the old paper rough against my fingertips. The initial relief that the legal nightmare was over had given way to the immense, complicated weight of Jonathan's confession. This was not a legal document. It was the final, devastating testament of a broken heart. I settled onto the small, wooden stool by the desk, the signed divorce decree resting beneath my hand. The scent of old cedar and pine seemed to hold its breath around the intimacy of the revelation. The letter was long, beautifully written in that precise, elegant hand, but looser, more reflective than his official script. It was addressed my dearest V, a tenderness I hadn't heard in years. He began not with the law but with shame. He explained that his departure 7 years ago had been an act of self-condemnation, not rejection. He was ashamed of his failures, financial, professional, personal, and felt he could no longer stand in the light of the successful, ordered life I had built. He left abruptly, intending to send the signed papers later, but he never did. The guilt was too heavy. The lie of my absence was easier than the truth of my failure, he wrote. I ran from the shame, but I couldn't run from the memory of you and Chloe. The core of his legal sabotage was revealed to be rooted not in malice, but in a profound, devastating emotional paralysis. He confessed that the guilt of his abrupt departure prevented him from legally severing the bond. He deliberately stalled the divorce, paying off the lawyer not to claim the estate, but because he feared that signing the papers would erase his right to be considered part of their family history. The legal connection, however painful, was his last desperate claim to a shared past. To sign that document V, his penmanship suddenly wavered slightly on the page, was to admit I deserved to be entirely cut out. To remain bound was to keep a single invisible thread between us. A selfish, cowardly anchor to the reality I couldn't bear to lose. He hadn't been watching the estate. He had been watching the family. Martha's reports of Chloe's good laughter and my quiet strength were his only sustenance in exile. He had created a legal loophole that acted as his own personal perpetual vigil. The most crucial part of the confession concerned the timing. the final act that coincided with Chloe's wedding. He wrote that he had known about the wedding for months, likely through the small, careful network of observation he had established. He realized that the upcoming ceremony represented the true, final independence of our family, the moment when the last piece of his control had to be relinquished. He decided to finally sign the papers, releasing the legal bond, as his last wedding gift to Chloe. He believed it was the only way to truly set Veronica free to enjoy the next chapter of her life, unburdened by his shame and legal ghost. I couldn't walk her down the aisle, he wrote, but I could sign the paper that guaranteed her mother's happiness. My last act of husbandly duty was to undo the lie I created. The shadow I saw at the wedding, the watcher in the crowd, was not a threat, but a man taking his final painful look at the family he loved, ensuring his gift of freedom was delivered before disappearing entirely. The letter concluded with a profound, aching apology for the immense legal and emotional chaos he had caused, and a final humble wish for my happiness. He never asked for forgiveness. He simply confessed the truth and let go. The cabin was not a lair of malice, but a self-made monastery of penance. The neatly signed papers were not a final attack, but a final, difficult blessing. The confession was beautifully written, a clear, elegant expression of a broken, brilliant man. But it only intensified the sadness of a life lived apart. The entire 7 years were a tragic waste. A deliberate separation rooted in an immense fear of rejection. He had caused decades of pain and chaos, all because he lacked the courage to simply say, "I love you," but I failed. I placed the letter on the desk, folding my hands over it. The legal uncertainty was gone, replaced by a terrible, clear emotional certainty. The entire crisis was an act of profound, misguided love. I sat in the quiet cabin, surrounded by the physical evidence of his devotion, the meticulously ordered life, the precise finality of the signed papers. The question of his death remained, but the motive for his life in exile was resolved. I stood up, leaving the signed papers on the desk. They would need to be filed immediately, the legal record finally corrected. The final truth I carried from the cabin was not one of revenge, but of the immense, damaging power of unspoken shame. I returned to Martha at her vegetable garden, the silent weight of the signed divorce decree now cold and heavy in my hand. The confession had revealed the motive, a lifetime of misguided love and shame. But the crucial part of the timeline, the sudden final release, remained tied to an action I couldn't understand. Why leave the cabin? Why sign the papers now, only to leave them for me to find after his departure? Martha was watering her kale, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up at me, her eyes kind but filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. She recognized the look on my face. She knew I had found the signed papers and read the final letter. "He told you it was time," Martha murmured, turning off the hose. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the silent cabin. "He didn't want you to think it was malice, did he? That was his greatest fear." I held out the signed papers. "He signed them 3 days before the wedding. He left the cabin right around that time. I need to know where he went, Martha. He must have gone somewhere." Martha walked to the small, weathered bench beside her garden. She sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. The sun was warm on the rich, dark soil. The final truth, the most agonizing piece of the timeline, settled around us. Martha revealed the truth gently, carefully, the way one handles fragile, sharp glass. "He didn't go anywhere, Veronica. Jonathan died quietly in the cabin about a week before the wedding. That's why he gave me the key and the instructions." The reality was a physical blow. The sudden, immense, chilling understanding that the silent, cedar-scented air in the cabin had been his final atmosphere. He hadn't just left the exile. He had ended it. Martha explained that Jonathan had been ill for some time. A long, quiet decline he had kept entirely secret, even from her, until the final weeks. He knew his time was short. The signing of the papers was his final, intentional act. He had orchestrated his death and the delayed discovery of the papers to coincide with the beginning of Chloe's new life. "He didn't want his illness to impose on your life," Martha whispered, her gaze distant. "He didn't want you or Chloe to have to care for him, or to watch him go. That was his final shame." The entire elaborate crisis, the 7 years of silence, and the delayed signing, all resolved into a single profound act of selfless timing. He had waited until the last possible moment to give me the legal freedom I deserved, ensuring that his death would not recomplicate my life or estate. But the shadow in the crowd, I insisted, my voice tight with a strange mix of painful grief and relief. I saw him. At the wedding. Across the field by the oaks. Martha smiled, a look of profound, aching understanding. He couldn't resist that final look, Veronica. He was in his car, parked on the service road beyond the preserve property line, the one that overlooks your field. He had just enough strength left. He watched the ceremony from a distance, just a few minutes, and then he drove back here. The agonizing reality was complete. He was the shadowy figure, observing his daughter's happiness one last time, the final quiet act of the watcher in the crowd. He witnessed the culmination of the life he had preserved, drove back to the cabin, and then a few days later quietly succumbed to his illness. The final signature was placed exactly when his vigil ended. The true reason for the missing signature was an agonizing, hidden love and guilt. He had preserved the bond to protect the family, and he released the bond as his final, most profound gift. I sat on the bench, the cold metal of the signed papers resting on my lap. The wave of painful, complex grief that washed over me was overwhelming. It wasn't the grief of loss, that had been managed 7 years ago, but the grief of lost time and unspoken truth. He had spent his final years consumed by a love he was too ashamed to express openly. Martha rose and placed a calloused hand on my shoulder. He finally set you free, Veronica. Not just legally, but from the shadow of the man you thought ran away. I knew the truth now. Jonathan Thomas was not a villain. He was a deeply flawed, terrified man who chose exile over shame, and preserved a legal loophole as a shield of love. His final act was to close that loophole, grant me freedom, and offer his last silent wish for my happiness. I stood up, holding the papers and the key. I had to file the decree, complete his final instruction, and close the legal chapter. But the emotional chapter would remain open, a profound, permanent sadness for the life we never recovered, and the man who died alone because he loved too much to ask for help. The return trip from the cabin was silent, the long miles a slow, deliberate processing of the truth. I carried the signed divorce decree and Jonathan's confession, the cold legal closure and the immense, painful emotional context. I no longer drove toward a life of fear, but toward one of responsibility. The ambiguity was gone. The truth was heavy, final, and entirely mine. The first, necessary act was bureaucratic. I went straight to the county clerk's office, the place where the crisis had begun. This time I did not need a pretense. I presented the fully executed document. The clerk, the same tired-eyed young woman, processed the paperwork, her movement efficient and devoid of judgment. The finality was administrative and absolute. The court officially finalized the divorce, 40 years too late. The original case status, pending/stalled, was finally changed to dissolved. The relationship, ended emotionally decades ago, was only now truly severed in the eyes of the law. I walked out of the office a free woman, not by assumption, but by confirmed record. The legal ghost was finally laid to rest. I returned home and sat with Chloe. I shared the final outcome. The divorce was officially finalized, the delay a technical error that had been corrected. I presented it as a necessary mundane piece of estate cleanup. Crucially, I shared the final outcome but not the raw, agonizing contents of the letter. Jonathan's shame, his illness, and his death in lonely penance were burdens I would carry alone, protecting Chloe's memory of her father as a complicated, distant man, not a tragic martyr. The quilt lay draped over the sofa, the velvet V-patch, though stitched again, still bearing the subtle mark of its surgery. It remained an important symbol, but its meaning had deepened. It was no longer just a chronicle of love and milestones. It now encompassed the complex, unfinished nature of human relationships, the silent sacrifices, the misunderstandings, and the lies of shame that can bind people more tightly than any legal document. My gaze drifted to the window, settling on the distant, shimmering line of the ocean. 4 years I had believed my past was a comfortable, clean narrative. I was wronged, I rebuilt my life, and I am free. That narrative had been my strength, my justification. Now Jonathan's lonely truth shattered that clean story. How will Veronica reconcile the comfortable narrative of her past with the profound, lonely truth Jonathan revealed? Reconciling freedom and sacrifice. The greatest reconciliation is realizing my freedom was not won by my strength alone, but purchased by Jonathan's silent sacrifice. I must now live with the knowledge that the secure, comfortable life I built was actively protected by the man I believed had abandoned me. My past was a shared effort, not a solitary triumph. I will have to find a way to honor the profound, flawed love without allowing the guilt of his exile to consume me. Embracing complexity and forgiveness. The easy narrative required labeling Jonathan as malicious and absent. The truth revealed a man agonized by shame who believed his continued, silent legal tether was the only way to safeguard his family's future. I must forgive the lie not because he asked for it, but because I now understand the depth of his anguish. The silence was agonizing, but it was not hate. The new narrative of the self, my identity, built on being the unbound and independent woman, must shift. I am not independent because I broke free. I am independent because Jonathan finally chose to let me go. My new narrative must incorporate this complexity, transforming my strength from one of defiance to one of grace and acceptance. I will carry the weight of his hidden love while pursuing the full happiness he wished for me. I stood by the window, feeling the cool air of the morning. The view of the distant ocean was immense and indifferent. I was no longer a woman defined by a pending case or a missing signature. I was a woman who held the final tragic secret of a man who loved deeply but flawed profoundly. The silence that settled around me was different from the silence of denial or fear. It was the definitive final peace I had always assumed I had. It was a peace earned through pain and understanding, not through simple legal maneuvering. The comfortable narrative was gone. The painful truth remained. My future would be built on the foundation of that revealed, complex, lonely love. I took a deep breath, accepting the immense, quiet burden of living the free life he died to give me. The quiet journey continues, but now, it is unburdened by the ghost of the pending/stalled years. Did you enjoy the story? And from which city are you listening? Tell me in the comments. I always love hearing from you. If this story touched your heart, you can support me with a super thanks. Your support helps me continue creating more stories for you. 2 more beautiful life stories are on your screen right now. I hope you enjoy them too. There's so much more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.